Good morning, and thank you for being with us for our Bible study period. It's good to be here, although not with you face to face, to be able to bring a message to you this morning. I appreciate Jeremy and Justin and the work that they've done in putting these recordings together, and Jeremy and I are the only ones here, so this is officially the smallest number of people I've ever spoken to in Bible class, but hopefully there's several listening and you'll get something out of the lesson this morning. Speaking of speaking at small congregations or small groups, Amanda and I used to attend Oak Grove in Sparta, and there was a member there named Mike Brandenburg, and Mike was a super guy, still is, and he loved the song, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be, and it was song 242 in our book, and he would, if he was leading singing, he would always lead number 242, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be. And if you were leading singing, he would request that you lead number 242. And so even today, when a song leader will get up and announce their number, if they sing 242, I think about Mike and I smile. But in the chorus of that song, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be, are the words, fair haven of rest for the weary. Fair haven of rest for the weary. The word rest is what I want to talk to you about this morning. That word means simply relief from burden. And there are many things in the world today that burden us. We are burdened by physical burdens sometimes, sickness and illness, even the toil that our physical jobs may take on us. We have emotional and mental burdens. Certainly during this coronavirus pandemic, we've all been burdened by that in one way or another. There's the burden of sin that the Bible talks extensively about, so we could talk about spiritual burdens, but there are any number of things that burden us. And that concept of rest, and that word just has a sweet connotation to it. After a long, hard day of work, whether it's physical work or mental work, that you would have rest. The Bible talks about rest extensively. Jesus himself promises rest. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He said, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And what I notice about that promise that Jesus made is that it's a conditional promise. Jesus said, I'll give you rest, but you've got to come to me. The promises that we have in the Scriptures are conditional. That's controversial maybe in some circles, but I think you can go back even into the days of Adam and Eve, and there was conditions to the promises given. Adam and Eve could have stayed in the Garden of Eden and lived it up probably forever. They just had to follow that condition of not eating that one piece of fruit, that one fruit from that one tree. You look at Noah. God told Noah, there's going to be a flood. I'm going to save you and your household, but the condition is you've got to build a boat. And you've got to build a boat to these specifications with this type of wood. And I suppose that had Noah made the decision to just kind of sit on his hands for decades and say, I trust you, Lord. I have faith that you'll save me, and not build that boat, there's no doubt that he would have drowned, him and his household, like everyone else on the earth did. So the promises of God are conditional, and the promise of rest is conditional. The Bible talks about, the writings of Paul talk about the promise of rest for the faithful versus the promise of punishment for the wicked. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8 is a familiar passage to a lot of us, and I've quoted verse 8 in particular a lot in lessons when we talk about hell and punishment, because it talks about how the Lord and vengeance is going to take vengeance on those who do not know God and who do not obey the gospel. But that preceding verse, verse 7, says to give you who are troubled rest. So, are there things that trouble you? Well, certainly there are. There are things that trouble all of us from day to day, and just things in the world in general maybe that trouble us. I'm troubled by the fact that there are some states in the United States of America who are writing tickets to people for attending worship services. All the while, abortion clinics are open for business. And that troubles me, and maybe that troubles you as well. And we could list a number of other things probably that trouble us. And so the promise of rest for those faithful Christians is certainly a promise that we should hold on to. But again, it's a conditional promise. And I think we'll see that in our lesson this morning from the book of Hebrews as we continue our study over the book of Hebrews. I want you to look at Hebrews chapter 4 with me. Starting in verse 1, the writer says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it." So immediately I see there that there's still a promise of rest. The writer reinforces what Jesus has said, that there is a promise of rest, but he also tells us something, that there's the possibility of coming short of that promise. And for me, if there's a possibility that I won't obtain that rest, or there's something that I could do to prevent myself from obtaining that promise of rest, I want to know what that is so that I can avoid making that mistake and missing out on the promise of rest. Now that first word in chapter 4 says therefore. And so it points back to chapter 3. And I want us to read the last 3 verses in chapter 3, or the last 4 verses in chapter 3, where it says, "For who, having rebelled, indeed was it not all who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell by the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." So the Hebrews writer points to a group of people who did not get the promise of rest. And he gives us an indication of why they didn't get a promise of rest. And that's written here so that you and I can know what could possibly keep us from obtaining the promise of rest that God has given us. Now, for those who have been with us on Sunday mornings and been a part of our Bible class, you're familiar with the story of the children of Israel, but we'll give a brief recap for those who maybe haven't been involved in our Bible study classes over the last year or two. The children of Israel were God's chosen people. There had been a promise made to Abraham. That promise was reinforced to Isaac and Jacob, that their descendants would be blessed. They would be a chosen people. They would be more numerous than the stars in heaven. Things would be really good for the nation of Israel. But before things were really good for the nation of Israel, things got really bad, because there arose in the book of Exodus a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who was worried about how numerous the Israelites were and made the decision to enslave them. And you can read about that in Exodus, how bad things got for the Israelites. And of course, you might remember that God sent Moses and sent plagues to convince the Egyptians to release those Israelites, and they went and headed towards the land of Canaan, the promised land, as it was called, because it was a land promised by God for these Israelites. And it came time to take the land, and they sent 12 spies, one from every nation in Israel, to go and look at the land. 10 of those spies came back and said, "The land's really good, but we can't have it because there's giants in the land. They're stronger than us. We're just not going to be able to go take this land." And 2 other spies, Joshua and Caleb, were faithful and said, "Let's go get it. We can absolutely take this land because God is on our side. He's made us this promise for generations that we're going to have this land. Let's go get it." Now the nation of Israel had a decision to make. Do we listen to the majority or the minority? The majority who says we can't do it even though God has promised this land, or the minority that says that we can, and like a lot of times we're guilty of, they followed the majority. They followed the majority that said we can't take this land, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. And so as punishment for that disobedience, God said, none of you are actually going to go in this land. Except for Joshua and Caleb, the rest of you over the next 40 years are going to die off wandering around in the wilderness. And so that's what happened. Now, when the Hebrews writer points to these people and says that God swore that they would not enter his rest because they did not obey, and in verse 19, because of their unbelief. It's a message to us that the things that will keep us from entering God's rest are the same things that kept the Israelites out. It's unbelief and disobedience. In the Scriptures, we are commanded to trust God, in other words, to have faith, but we're also commanded to obey God, to have obedience. And the Hebrews writer in this passage is urging us to avoid the mistakes that the Israelites made. Their mistake was not having faith that led to obedience. Now, I suppose, had you asked those Israelites, even those 10 spies, by the way, those 10 spies, do you remember any of their names? Their names are all recorded. They're in the Scriptures. You could look them up, but you don't remember a single one of their names, but you remember the names of Joshua and Caleb who were faithful. But I suppose if you asked even those 10 spies who said, we can't go and take that land, do you believe in God? They probably would have said yes. Even the rest of the nation who was scared and didn't want to go and take the land, if you asked them, do you have faith in God? They would have said, sure, we have faith in God. Sure, we know who God is. We believe in God. God is the one who sent those plagues that scared the Egyptians into letting us leave. God is the one who parted the Red Sea that we could cross over as on dry land. God's the one who sent the manna so that we've had something to eat. Yeah, of course we believe in God. Of course we have faith in God. Well, will you obey Him and go and take the land of Canaan that He's promised you? Oh no, we can't do that. There's all these reasons why we can't obey God. And isn't that a mistake that some make today? They'll tell you, oh, I believe God, I have faith in God, but I'm not ready to obey Him. I'm not willing to do what He's asked me to do as far as being obedient to Him. They have a messed up definition of what faith is, because faith leads to obedience. True faith leads to obedience. And so the Hebrews writer says in verse 19 that they could not enter in because of unbelief. It wasn't that they didn't believe in God. It was that they didn't believe enough to obey from a faithful, obedient heart what He had commanded. Now, all of us are drawing closer to eternity. And our eternity is going to be characterized either by rest or by torment. In Revelation chapter 14, there's a stark contrast given between the rest that the believers will have in heaven and the torment and lack of rest that they'll have in hell. If you look in Revelation 14, verse 11, it says, and the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. No rest for the wicked. People who are experts in torture, one of the things that they'll do is sleep deprivation. They'll make people have a lack of rest, and it's awful. And those who suffer from just natural sleep deprivation have a lot of other health issues because we all need rest. Well, hell is going to be characterized by a place of no rest. Now you contrast that with the next two verses, beginning in verse 12. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them. We've used that passage. It's brought comfort to thousands of families at gravesides, that rest will be promised to those who die in the Lord. But it should also bring comfort to those of us who are living, who are trying to serve as faithful Christians, that we have that same promise of rest if we remain faithful. But we have to remain faithful. Sometimes we may be guilty of giving people the impression that baptism is the end of their journey to become a Christian and to be a Christian. Well, baptism is a critical part, and it's a part that is necessary and that unfortunately a lot of folks have tried to minimize, but it's only the beginning of the journey. to obtain that promise of rest, we have to continue to be faithful. We can't be like that stony soil that Jesus talked about in Matthew 13, that stony soil who is on fire at the beginning, but when tribulations come and hard times come, it withers away because it doesn't stay faithful. We must, as Christians, remain faithful in order to obtain the promise of rest. I wonder about those Israelites, how long 40 years must have seemed. Not all of them lived the entire 40 years, but some lived at least the majority of that 40 years that they wandered around in the wilderness, and everybody over the age of 20 other than Joshua and Caleb died off. And so they saw their brothers and their sisters and their parents and friends die off one by one as they waited for that entire generation to pass before they were allowed to enter the promised land. 40 years had to seem like an eternity. But how much longer will an actual eternity be? Think about the rich man in Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus, a story that we're familiar with. He was in torment and he knew exactly. He had the opportunity to think back to the moments of his life. He knew who Lazarus was, just like those Israelites had the opportunity to think back to the moment that they disobeyed God. No doubt that rich man in Luke 16 had those same opportunities throughout all of eternity to think back on the opportunity that was missed to be obedient to God. The example of Israel serves as a warning to us that faith and faithfulness must follow hearing. If you look at chapter 3 and verse 6 and notice what it says in Hebrews, but Christ is a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. We have to keep on keeping on in order to obtain that rest. If you continue reading in Hebrews chapter 4, the writer continues to kind of talk about Israel and the mistake that they made and contrast that with how we should live. And in verse 11 says, "Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience." That word diligent draws my attention in that it denotes effort on our part. Be diligent. Diligence says I have to have effort, I have to have stamina, I have to have perseverance. Not that I'm going to live a perfect life, not that I'm never going to sin or make a mistake, because certainly that's not true, but I'm not just going to sit on my hands and say I've got faith. I'm going to have a faith that leads to obedience, a faith that the Israelites lacked. To those who are burdened, the promise of rest offers hope. The difficulties and struggles of this life are temporary. I want to leave you with one final passage of Scripture from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and I think as we deal with the coronavirus and the things going on in our world, this Scripture hopefully brings us comfort. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." As the song says, "Fair haven of rest for the weary, how beautiful heaven must be." Let's continue to try to live in such a way that heaven would be our home and we would obtain that rest that's been promised so many times in the Scriptures. Again, we appreciate you being with us this morning for our Bible study period. Certainly, if you have any comments or questions, we would invite you to put those in the comments section and whatever social media avenue you may be watching, or you can always contact us at the building and leave a message and someone will return your call. Again, we look forward to the opportunity to hopefully be back together face to face very soon.